In 1979, when neighboring farms were auctioning off equipment and declaring bankruptcy at a rate not seen since the Great Depression, Jim Harrelson made a decision that seemed insane. He sold everything except one tractor. While the USDA reported that farm debt had ballooned to $166 billion and interest rates were climbing past 20%, this third-generation Nebraska rancher walked away from the expansion mindset that had consumed American agriculture. His neighbors thought he'd lost his mind. The bank officers who'd been courting him for loans suddenly went silent. But as foreclosure signs sprouted across the Midwest like a grim harvest, Harrelson's operation, radically simplified, ruthlessly focused, not only survived, but quietly thrived. This is the story of how doing less saved one family farm when doing more destroyed thousands. If you're settling in to hear how one man's counterintuitive choice rewrote the rules of survival, grab your coffee and get comfortable. This journey through America's most devastating agricultural crisis will challenge everything you think you know about growth, success, and what it really takes to weather an economic storm. Don't forget to subscribe. Stories like this deserve to be remembered, and the lessons they carry are more relevant now than ever. The 1970s were intoxicating years for American farmers, a golden decade that felt like it would never end. Global demand for U.S. grain was soaring, driven by massive sales to the Soviet Union and growing populations across developing nations. Land values were climbing so fast that farmers who'd bought property for $500 an acre in 1970 watched it hit $2,000 by 1978. The message from agricultural economists, government agencies, and banks was unanimous and relentless: expand or die. Secretary of Agriculture Earl Butz famously urged farmers to plant fence row to fence row, to leverage their appreciating land, buy more acreage, invest in bigger equipment, and scale up operations to meet what seemed like infinite global appetite. It was the American dream on steroids, and the entire rural economy was drunk on possibility. Credit flowed like spring rain across the heartland. Banks weren't just willing to lend. They were actively pursuing farmers, offering loans with terms that seemed too good to refuse. Why wouldn't they? Farmland was the safest collateral imaginable, appreciating year after year, and the boom appeared structural rather than cyclical. Young farmers took out massive loans to buy out retiring neighbors. Established operations doubled and tripled their acreage. Equipment dealerships couldn't keep inventory on their lots. Everyone wanted the newest, biggest combines, tractors, and implements. The logic was seductive and seemingly ironclad. Borrow against today's land value to buy more land that will be worth even more tomorrow, then use the increased production to service the debt. It was a perpetual motion machine of wealth creation, or so everyone believed. Jim Harrelson had resisted the siren song longer than most, but even he felt the pressure mounting. His 640-acre operation in south-central Nebraska had been in his family since his grandfather homesteaded it in 1921. By 1978, he was running a typical diversified farm: corn, soybeans, wheat, and a small cattle operation, with equipment that was paid off, but aging. His banker, Tom Peterson, had been stopping by more frequently, always friendly, always casual, but always with the same underlying message. Harrelson was sitting on a gold mine and failing to maximize its potential. The Johnson's place adjacent to his property was coming up for sale, another 480 acres of prime bottomland. Peterson had run the numbers a dozen different ways, and they all looked good. With land appreciation alone, Harrelson could borrow $400,000, buy the Johnson place, and watch his net worth climb by $500,000 in just a few years. But something gnawed at Harrelson, an instinct he couldn't quite articulate at Sunday dinners when his wife brought up the Johnson property, or during coffee at the grain elevator when other farmers talked about their expansion plans. His father had survived the 1950s farm crisis by staying small and avoiding debt, a lesson delivered in stern warnings that echoed across Harrelson's childhood. The old man had died in 1976, just before the boom reached its fever pitch, and Harrelson sometimes wondered what he would have made of this new era. The math looked perfect on paper, the opportunities seemed once in a lifetime, and everyone, literally everyone, was saying the same thing. Yet that quiet unease persisted, a whisper of caution in a stadium full of cheerleaders. By early 1979, that whisper was about to become a scream, though no one in the heartland could hear it coming over the roar of optimism and diesel engines. The phone call came on a January morning in 1980, Tom Peterson's voice carrying an unfamiliar tension beneath its usual warmth. Could Jim stop by the bank that afternoon? Nothing urgent, just wanted to discuss a few things. Harrelson drove into town through fields that looked skeletal and gray under a flat winter sky, the kind of landscape that made you forget summer ever existed. When he walked into Peterson's office, the banker wasn't alone. His regional supervisor sat in the corner, a man in a dark suit whom Harrelson had never met. The small talk died quickly. Interest rates were climbing faster than anyone had anticipated, Peterson explained, already past 15% and showing no signs of stopping. The Federal Reserve, under new chairman Paul Volcker, was determined to crush inflation no matter the cost. Grain prices, meanwhile, were softening. The Soviet grain embargo, imposed after their invasion of Afghanistan, had cut off the market that had driven the entire boom. The supervisor leaned forward with numbers that made Harrelson's stomach tighten. If rates hit 20%, the debt service on farms leveraged for expansion would become unsustainable. Peterson, to his credit, looked genuinely pained as he walked through the implications. Farmers who'd borrowed heavily in the past 2 years were already underwater. Their debt exceeded the declining value of their land, and their operating loans were being called in or renewed at rates that devoured their margins. The bank wasn't foreclosing yet, Peterson assured him, but they needed farmers to right-size their operations, consolidate where possible, maybe sell some equipment to reduce exposure. Then he asked the question that hung in the air like gun smoke. What was Harrelson's debt load? When Jim answered, $47,000, all of it on equipment he'd bought in 1976. Both men visibly relaxed. Peterson actually smiled. Jim was in the enviable position of being able to weather this, maybe even help the bank by taking on some distressed properties at bargain prices. There would be opportunities, Peterson said, his voice regaining its promotional warmth, for smart operators with clean balance sheets. Harrelson drove home in silence, his mind racing through scenarios that all seemed to end in the same place. He could play it safe, ride out the storm, maybe pick up some land cheap when his neighbors went under. The rational, self-interested move. Or he could double down on debt like everyone else, betting that this was just a temporary correction, and the boom would resume. But something had crystallized in that office, watching the regional supervisor's cold calculation and Peterson's desperate optimism. The system itself was broken. The entire structure of modern American agriculture had become a Ponzi scheme dependent on perpetually rising land values and cheap credit. When those two pillars crumbled, and they were crumbling right now, the whole edifice would collapse. The farmers who'd followed every expert's advice, who'd done exactly what they were supposed to do, were going to be destroyed not because they were bad at farming, but because they'd trusted a system that was fundamentally unsustainable. That night, Harrelson sat at his kitchen table with his wife, Sarah, and laid out a plan that sounded crazy even as he spoke it. He would sell everything except the essentials. Keep one good tractor, one truck, basic implements, and the cattle. Dump the fancy equipment, the spare machinery, even some of the newer stuff. Pay off every penny of debt and bank whatever was left. Then he'd farm differently. Fewer acres, more intensively, with almost no overhead. Sarah listened, her face unreadable, then asked the question that mattered. Could they survive on less revenue? Harrelson didn't know, but he knew the alternative was watching everything his grandfather and father had built. get auctioned off piece by piece when the bank came calling. His neighbors would think he was giving up, retreating, admitting defeat. Let them think that. In 6 months, he predicted, half of them would be fighting for closure. Better to be small and solvent than big and bankrupt. Sarah nodded slowly, and they shook hands across the table like business partners sealing a deal. The decision was made. The auction happened on a cold Saturday in March, and Harrelson felt like he was presiding over his own funeral. The good equipment went fast. His nearly new combine, the big 4-wheel drive tractor, the grain cart, the field cultivator he'd bought just 3 years earlier. Neighbors and dealers picked through his machinery like vultures, getting deals they couldn't believe, wondering aloud what had gotten into Jim Harrelson. Was he sick? Getting divorced? Giving up farming altogether? He offered no explanations, just watched the auctioneer's rhythmic chant turn years of accumulated equipment into a check for $83,000. After settling his debts and setting aside operating capital, he had $38,000 in the bank. More cash than he'd ever had in his life, but also the smallest machinery lineup of any serious farmer in the county. What he kept told the story of his new strategy: a 1974 John Deere 443, zero tractor with 3,800 hours, mechanically sound but aesthetically battered, a 20-year-old grain truck, a modest disc, planter, and cultivator, hay equipment for his 50-head cattle operation, and hand tools that most farmers had stopped using a decade ago. He cut his planted acres from 520 to 180, focusing only on the best ground closest to his buildings. The rest he either left fallow or converted to rotational pasture for cattle. The math was brutal, but simple. His old operation generated about $140,000 in gross revenue, with $118,000 in expenses and debt service, leaving him with $22,000. His new operation would generate maybe $65,000 gross, but with expenses stripped to the bone. No equipment payments, minimal fuel, reduced chemical inputs. His net would actually be higher. It required believing that less could be more, that efficiency mattered more than scale, and that survival trumped status. The psychological shift was harder than the financial one. Harrelson had been raised in a culture that measured a man's worth by the acres he farmed and the iron he owned. Driving past neighbors' fields in his aging tractor while they piloted air-conditioned behemoths felt like wearing a scarlet letter of failure. When he explained his reasoning at the coffee shop, that he was positioning for a long crisis, that debt was death in a deflationary environment, that small and nimble would outlast big and leveraged, he saw polite skepticism and poorly concealed pity. Even Sarah had moments of doubt, especially when the minister's wife asked if everything was okay at home. But Harrelson had done something most people find nearly impossible. He'd emotionally divested from the opinions of his community. Their approval had been based on participating in a shared delusion, and he'd chosen reality over belonging. The single tractor philosophy extended beyond machinery into every corner of the operation. He stopped buying inputs he didn't absolutely need, started fixing things himself instead of calling the dealer, traded labor with a few neighbors who hadn't completely written him off, and accepted that some fields would have weeds and some yields would be lower. He wasn't trying to maximize production. He was trying to maximize the ratio between input and output, to create an operation so lean it could survive on margins that would starve everyone else. When corn prices dropped below the cost of production in late 1980, Harrelson harvested only what he needed for cattle feed and left the rest standing, letting it rot rather than paying to harvest a crop worth less than the diesel to get it out. His neighbors, locked into bank agreements that required them to plant every acre and harvest every bushel to service debt, watched in horror as he walked away from perfectly good corn. But Harrelson wasn't farming for yield anymore. He was farming for survival, and survival meant knowing when to cut losses rather than throwing good money after bad. By 1982, the apocalypse Harrelson had glimpsed in Tom Peterson's office had fully materialized across the Midwest. Interest rates had peaked at 21.5%, the highest in American history, turning every dollar of debt into an anchor dragging farmers toward insolvency. Corn prices had collapsed from $3.50 a bushel to under $2, below the cost of production for most operations. Land values were in free fall. Property that sold for $2,000 an acre in 1979 couldn't find buyers at $800. The farm crisis had its own vocabulary now. Foreclosure auctions every week, suicide hotlines advertised on rural radio, families packing up in the middle of the night to escape the shame. The Johnson's place, the one Peterson had wanted Harrelson to buy, went back to the bank and sat empty. Windows broken by vandals, fields reverting to weeds. Harrelson drove past it sometimes and felt not vindication, but a deep, tired sadness for the dreams it represented. The simplified operation gave Harrelson advantages that weren't obvious until the crisis deepened. With no debt service, he could make decisions based on agronomic sense rather than bank requirements. When fertilizer prices spiked in 1981, he cut applications by 60% and accepted lower yields, something leveraged farmers couldn't do without violating loan covenants. When his tractor needed a $3,000 transmission repair, he pulled it himself over 2 weeks, ordering parts piecemeal and learning from a retired mechanic in exchange for beef. The cattle operation, which he'd once considered a sideline, became his anchor. The guaranteed income from live animal sales created cash flow when grain markets offered nothing but losses. He started selling directly to local restaurants and families, bypassing commodity markets entirely, getting premium prices for quality beef from buyers who appreciated knowing their farmer. It was the kind of relationship-based agriculture his grandfather had practiced, now rediscovered by necessity. The math that saved him was stark when compared to regional averages. The USDA reported that Midwest farms averaged $267,000 in debt by 1982, with annual debt service consuming 61% of gross revenue. Harrelson had zero debt and operating expenses that consumed only 42% of his much smaller gross revenue. When corn hit $1.80 a bushel, below the variable cost of production for most operations, his break-even point was $1.45 because his overhead was so low. He wasn't making much money, but he wasn't bleeding to death either. The tractor that neighbors had pitied him for running became a symbol of liberation. It was paid for, repairable, and adequate, while equipment dealers went bankrupt and farmers couldn't get parts for complex machinery. Harrelson kept his simple rig running with tools and knowledge, untethered from supply chains that were collapsing under the weight of the crisis. The hardest part wasn't the economics. It was watching the human cost unfold around him. The Mitchells, who farmed 2,200 acres and had been considered the most successful operation in the county, lost everything in a February 1983 auction that drew gawkers from 3 states. Bill Mitchell had a heart attack 2 months later at 51. The Andersons held on until 1984, then divorced and left farming entirely. Peterson, the banker who'd pushed expansion so enthusiastically, took early retirement and moved to Arizona, unable to face the farmers whose lives his advice had destroyed. Harrelson attended the auctions when he could, sometimes buying a tool or piece of equipment, but mostly bearing witness. These weren't failures of character or competence. They were casualties of a system that had promised prosperity and delivered devastation. The guilt of surviving when others didn't haunted him, a survivor's burden he carried, even as his own stubborn existence proved that different choices had been possible all along. When the farm crisis finally bottomed out in 1986, the American agricultural landscape had been permanently transformed. Nearly 300,000 farms had disappeared, representing not just economic units, but families, histories, and ways of life that stretched back generations. The foreclosure epidemic had hollowed out rural communities, shuttering small-town businesses that depended on farm income, closing schools as families fled to cities, leaving behind ghost towns where church bells rang for congregations that no longer existed. The farms that survived were increasingly corporatized, consolidated into larger and larger operations, run with industrial efficiency and distant capital. The era of the independent family farm, already in decline, had suffered a wound from which it would never fully recover. Jim Harrelson had survived, but he'd survived into a world that looked nothing like the one in which he'd made his fateful decision. For Harrelson himself, the years after 1986 brought a quiet vindication that felt hollow without his neighbors to share it. Land values stabilized and began climbing again. Commodity prices recovered modestly. The banking system, bloodied and chastened, became more conservative in its lending, closing the barn door long after the horses had escaped. Harrelson gradually expanded again, but with a different philosophy, buying distressed properties for cash, adding acres only when he could afford them outright, maintaining the lean operational structure that had saved him. By 1995, he was farming 920 acres debt-free, with equipment that was functional rather than fancy, and a reputation as either the smartest or stubbornest man in the county, depending on who was talking. His son, who left for college in 1982, convinced he wanted nothing to do with farming, came back in 1994, drawn by the rare example of an agricultural operation that was actually sustainable. The lessons from Harrelson's experience transcend agriculture and speak to fundamental principles of surviving any economic crisis. First, the courage to move against the crowd, to trust your instincts when every expert is saying the opposite, separates survivors from casualties in every market collapse. Second, debt is not just a financial instrument. It's a surrender of agency that turns you into a prisoner of circumstances you can't control, forced to make decisions that serve creditors rather than long-term survival. Third, simplification is not retreat, but strategy. Eliminating complexity creates resilience, turning potential points of failure into sources of strength. Fourth, efficiency beats scale in a contracting environment. What matters isn't how much you produce, but how much you keep. And finally, the willingness to accept social disapproval, to be thought foolish or timid, or unsuccessful by people operating on doomed assumptions, is perhaps the hardest and most essential choice of all. What Harrelson's story reveals most powerfully is that resilience isn't about strength or resources, or even intelligence. It's about the willingness to let go. In 1979, he let go of the expansion dream, the bigger is better mythology, the keeping up with neighbors imperative, and the expert consensus that demanded he grow or die. That letting go looked like failure to everyone watching, right up until the moment their own empires collapsed and his modest operation endured. The single tractor strategy wasn't really about the tractor at all. It was about having the clarity to identify what was essential and the courage to abandon everything else, even when abandoning meant standing alone. In an age of over-leveraged individuals, families, businesses, and nations, the rancher who defied the 1979 farm crisis by choosing less offers a blueprint that's less about agriculture than about the timeless arithmetic of survival. That sometimes the only way forward is to get smaller, simpler, and more honest about what you can actually afford, financially, emotionally, and spiritually, to lose.